Have you given any thought to contributing to the melt? It's easy to do. Just click the Patreon link in the episode notes, and for as little as $3 a month, you can get access to bonus episodes, early access to regular episodes, and you can also participate in monthly Zoom meetups. It helps to keep the magic happening here at the Melt. So I encourage you to karmically entangle yourself with the Melt today by subscribing monthly for less than the price of a container of goatee wax, or a prosthetic pinky, or a half stick of DMT butter, or an inflatable casket, or the shrunken head of an Atlantean supermodel, or a woolly mammoth's merkin, or a crystalline replica of Baba Yaga's hut, or a capsule of Sasquatch dander.
This is Hunter Muse.
And this is Chris Snipes, and you are listening
to The Melt.
Many in the UFO community have grown accustomed to thinking of beings in flying saucers as having come from a distant galaxy or solar system. Late author and blogger Mac Tonnies coined the term cryptoterrestrial to describe a humanoid species indigenous to Earth that sort of masquerades as aliens so that they can move among us in stealth. By appearing to us as entities from somewhere else, they could assure the secrecy of their existence right under the surface of our planet and perhaps on or under land masses that we don't have access to. Today's guest, Australian author Ryan Musgrave-Evans, posits in his new book, Children of Orion, Finding the Cryptoterrestrials, that much of the phenomenon that we usually attribute to the paranormal, cryptids, and extraterrestrials are often really caused by the cryptoterrestrials, or CTs. What we perceive as almost superpowers, like walking through walls, invisibility, levitating, and telepathy, can be attributed to their highly advanced technology. But what I think is the most compelling piece of this puzzle is that the species referred to as the CTs are actually us from far in the future. I start off the conversation by asking Ryan what it was that led him to this subject matter.
Well, I've had a lot of interesting paranormal experiences over my life, and some of them gave rise to an interest in fairies and elves, because I presumed when I was a kid in teen years that what I was dealing with or what I was perceiving was perhaps linked to earth spirits, or I interpret it as maybe being related to like the old Celtic fairy faith or something like that, which spawned a real interest in that kind of thing, like Gaelic pre-Christian beliefs and the fairy faith, etc. And more experiences I had as an adult sort of shifted gear a little bit and became more stereotypically close encounter ET in vibe, and I found that interesting, and I could see that there was some kind of link there, that this was an interaction with the same or very similar beings. And as I got more and more interested in the ET side of things, because it seemed to be more reflective, some of my experiences more reflective of that kind of more traditional, typical ET experience, like clinical procedures and levitating up into craft and this kind of thing, these kinds of motifs. I suddenly had a passion for researching as much as I could about ufology. And I came across this notion of the CT that the late Mac Tonys, who unfortunately passed away in his 30s as a very young man, he'd formulated what he called the Cryptoterrestrial hypothesis, or CTH for brevity. And he floated it out there as an alternative explanation to the usual, what he saw as a dogmatic ETH, or extraterrestrial hypothesis. He was saying perhaps some of the evidence is pointing down the road more clearly to the nature of these beings being more of this earth, perhaps an indigenous race, not extraterrestrial or extrasolar, because lots of people would suggest that whatever is behind ET-related UFO phenomena today, not only is it extraterrestrial, but it's also extrasolar. It's from beyond our solar system, quite often people suggest. And Mac Toney said, hold on a sec, like a running theme through all of this kind of abduction lore and also fairy lore is an interest in our genetics, an interest in coupling with us, in producing perhaps some kind of hybrid or mixed race. And he said that, in his opinion, the notion that the beings have no evolutionary history with Earth or with us is out. In his opinion, that was highly unlikely. So he was suggesting they were maybe a sister species to us, closely related to us genetically, perhaps impoverished genetically in some respects, so requiring access to our DNA, not just in a sort of clinical medical kind of way of taking samples of our DNA, but even literally in the old-fashioned sense, copulating with us, which is what the fairies and elves sometimes did as well in Celtic myth. You have like Antonio Villas-Boas in 1957, an abduction where he mated with a female with white hair and huge blue eyes. Peter Curry in Australia, in Sydney in 1992, another woman with fair hair, huge blue eyes, a similar situation. And he also suggested, McToney suggested, built into his idea of the cryptoterrestrial, or the CT, this idea that it covers one underlying race responsible for older mythological non-human entities and the non-human beings, the euphonauts, perhaps you'd call them, of today. So it's sort of like an umbrella term that covers ancient ideas of these guys abducting people. Killing cattle was another fairy and elf pastime. If we grazed our cattle too close to areas where they had subterranean habitations, that they would sometimes mutilate cattle, which is recurring again in the UFO lore of today. So there's all these similarities, and certain particular CTs as well, like a particular race of fairy or elf. And when I say fairy or elf, I'll just qualify that a meaning in the old-fashioned sense in the Celtic fairy faith of these non-human entities that are a societal race that are living underground, that and of different appearances and things, but they make it clear to mortals in the old days. They'd say to mortals in the old days when there'd be some interaction, we can appear any way we like. We can confuse you. We can cast glamours upon you. And this again is repeated in UFO lore, where the ETs seem to be able to manipulate and control our minds. So one particular race, Nahuishlan, the gentry, tall, fair, subterranean dwelling beings that chirped and whistled, that floated around on the dusk at dusk on the horizon as will-o'-wisp, or illuminated blobs or people, luminous beings. That would enter into people's houses and behave more like a poltergeist and change things and play tricks and remove things. Now, when you look at UFO lore and you look at someone like Charles James Hall, who wrote the books Millennial Hospitality, who claimed to have been posted as a weather observer at Nellis Air Force Base in the 60s, who claimed to have regular and prolonged interaction with a tall, fair race, subterranean dwelling that would whistle and chirp, that floats around as luminous beings, that would go into his weather shack and rearrange things and mess with him. basically identical descriptions for Nahuishlan and what nowadays in ufology we might call tall whites. And this is the term I've adopted from McToney's. Then I thought that was proper and fitting. Cryptoterrestrials.
Yeah, I thought it was genius back when I heard Jacques Vallée compare UFOs and aliens to fairy and elf encounters. I thought, like, I don't know, for whatever reason, I hadn't made that connection several years ago when I stumbled across an interview or something where he said that. But there's so many similarities. The circle motif, fairy circles, the abductions, the copulation with mortals, like, it just makes sense. It makes total sense. And a fascinating thing that I found about your book was that you seem to attribute a lot of paranormal activity to CTs, and even you incorporate the Bigfoot into that. What role do you think that? Because I'm curious about that aspect of it, and you went into it in the book, but I was hoping for a little more. Do you think that they have something to do with these CTs? Are they the CTs? What do you think's going on there?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to Bigfoot, Sasquatch, I think, I'm not quite sure. I don't want to be putting myself out there as arguing against the existence of Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I mean, I don't know whether or not they exist, but I know that certain points of evidence that people attribute to Bigfoot are CT based. Like, for instance, the Sierra Sounds that Al Berry and Ron Moorhead recorded in the Sierra Nevada mountains, California, in the 70s. They are definitely tall whites. Definitely. I've heard them. Their natural language sounds kind of like Japanese, a deep version, a resonating version of Japanese. Another tall white experiencer, Julio Fernandez in Spain in the 1970s, gave a wonderful description in a Flying Saucer Review magazine that I came across. He drew the beings as well with long, heavy chins, huge blue eyes. They were quite tall, over 6.5 foot tall, these individuals that took him on board a Flying Saucer, but he gave a wonderful description. He said their language sounds like the cries of the martial arts of the Orient. And they talked about
Samurai
it being thrown up from the diaphragm and the stomach, and interspersed with barking sounds. So in my opinion, the Sierra Sounds, which is often attributed to being evidence for Sasquatch, it's often listed among the most convincing pieces of evidence for the existence of Sasquatch. In my opinion, is real, but nonetheless cryptoterrestrials. And then you go to other cases where large, previously thought extinct creatures, say like dire wolves, giant wolves, other kinds of giant canids like big dogs with bushy tails, giant, otherwise thought extinct hominids like Bigfoot, hairy creatures, are associated with what I would normally say was a cryptoterrestrial haunting. Like, for instance, Skinwalker Ranch, which I believe is a fairly typical of reflecting an underground CT habitation where the CTs wish to intimidate or repel people that they don't approve of living too close to their land, that may have ideas about hunting, that have dogs, that have guns and things like that they consider to be dangerous to them or their children. They will launch these kinds of like a psychological warfare against them. Poltergeist activity, confuse people, play jokes on them, kill their cattle is another one that the fairies have been doing for a long time. Kill their dogs or animals. Usually fall short of injuring Homo sapiens, but nonetheless playing fairly dirty in a lot of other respects. Filling people with visceral, illogical fear by way of their technologies that they have in their helmets, convincing people that they're in danger of their lives, even though there might not be any obvious reason to fear. That some of these, what we'd normally think of and call cryptids, like giant wolves that shouldn't exist anymore, or Bigfoot-like creatures may be another tool in their kit, which is some kind of what I call in my book transient life forms, transitory life forms, maybe TLFs. It's just hypothetical that this may be what they're using them for. But, in the Skinwalker Ranch case, the rancher fired a high-powered rifle at a giant wolf that was attacking his lambs. There was no pain response from the creature. Pieces of flesh were blown out the back of it, and trotted off, and then they tracked it, and then the footprints just stopped. They disappeared like it had been beamed up by Scotty. But what are they? Well, they don't seem to be alive, these beings, or if they are alive, it's in some limited sense, perhaps. And the flesh that was blown off the back of it, I've heard Colin Callagher talking about how that was decaying or decayed when it was retrieved from the ground. Like the creature itself may have been made of decayed flesh, like some kind of zombie or reanimation, or perhaps the flesh, once it left the animal, rapidly decayed.
Strange.
Who knows? But very, very strange. So that's and there's a few cases like that. There's that Colorado ranch case as well, which is more and more people are talking about that now. There's a I think the head of MUFON in Colorado, I've forgotten the lady's name now. She actually was involved with that ranch and had friends that lived on it, or she even lived on it at one stage. I can't remember exactly now. And she's been talking a lot about this ranch now, but a sort of like a sister case to Skinwalker Ranch, where it had like the same kind of paranormal phenomena for the most part, but Bigfoot phenomena as well, mixed in with poltergeist stuff and ET, UFO related stuff and all this kind of thing. But the rancher in that particular case met the CTs, met thin, fair beings with blonde hair and huge eyes in helmets, wearing suits that were sort of like changing color as he spoke to them, that said to him, this isn't really working out, is it? We don't necessarily want you here. We've tried to be kind to you, but we need to work out some alternative scenario, an agreement between us. So they were being reasonable with the rancher, and they said, we are going to allow you to remember this. And while all this was happening, there was a cube on the ground, and the rancher went to move towards it, and they said, do not touch that, it's lethal. And then a Bigfoot-type creature came out of the trees, walked over to it, touched it, and fell down dead, or immobilized at least. And they said to the rancher, you see, they're lethal. Like it was some kind of proof, a demonstration. Now, so here we've got, again, the Bigfoot appearing in tandem with what I would have thought were cryptoterrestrials. Now, these beings were 5'6", and in my book I talk mostly about a group that call themselves the Mudgeoners, even though I don't use that word that much in that book, but I will in my second book more. Their own word for themselves, Mudgeoner. But what Charles Hall would have called tall whites, or what the Gales would have called Uishlan. Tall, fair, chirping, growling, barking beings that live in our earth. It's subterranean dwelling, high sophisticated levels of technology. But in the 5'6", well, they take a very long time to grow. They can take 100 years to even reach 6 foot tall, and then by the time they're like 700 or 800 years old, they can be as high as 9 or 10 foot. So you can sort of judge their age by their height as well. So if those two individuals that this rancher met, these two males, were about 5'6", they're probably like about 70 years old or something like that. And the individual that Peter Curry met in Sydney, she was about 7 foot tall, he said, which would make her quite advanced in age. She had a particularly long, heavy chin. As they get older and they grow taller and taller, their faces get longer as well, and their chins get really long and heavy and pointed. Whereas the woman, the female that was in the Antonio Villas-Boas case, the Brazilian farmer that was farming at night to escape the heat of the day, and a red light in the sky landed, and it was a craft, and he was wrestled aboard, and he had intercourse with a woman that was only about 4'6", I think he said she was. Now, she would still probably be 50 years old or something like that. a sexually mature individual, very short. Now, this is interesting evidence in itself as well, which is a little bit of a side as to, or it speaks to the fertile longevity of the female CTs, like their fertile lifespan in that sense, of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, perhaps. You had two females that were presenting themselves as succubi, perhaps you could call them, or Yan and Shi, fairy lovers, of massive differentiation in height, which means massive disparity in age. But anyway, sorry, I'm wandering off point. Yeah, the Sasquatch and poltergeist activity and ghost activity, in my opinion, is usually related to CT behavior and interaction as a kind of residue phenomenon, you might call it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. You mentioned the CTs potentially are subterranean dwellers. Do you think that they're interdimensional at all?
Yeah, I think so. They're time travelers and future versions of us, in a sense, that have come back and are replenishing their DNA with ancient free-range humans of a kind, us. But time travel, as far as I understand it, is akin to interdimensional travel. You can't really travel up and down your own time stream. You have to find other versions of the universe that are reminiscent of the way yours was earlier on in its life. It can get quite confusing, but interdimensional, yeah, I think they can be interdimensional, and they use portals. They have technologies to use wormholes. When larger objects pass through these wormholes, you hear a boom normally, whereas if it's if it's an individual, it can be just a click or a crack, and a smell like rotten eggs or rotten flesh can be associated with objects passing through portals. And they're, I go by McToney's general idea that the CTs, this is where he departed from, say, Jacques Vallée or John Keel when they talked. Jacques Vallée, when he talks about, like in Passport to Magonia, and he talks about, like you were saying before, Chris, he recognised Jacques Vallée a long, long time ago in the 60s or whenever it was he wrote Passport to Magonia, that there seems to be this relationship between fairy myths and the ETs of today. But he seemed to think that perhaps, I don't know what Jacques Vallée thinks about this today, but back in those days, he wanted to, I think, the way he spoke about it, it was sort of like esoteric in his mind, or that there was something highly metaphysical and almost perhaps like the nature of the beings themselves is somehow intrinsically unknowable to us, that we may never really understand it, that it is beyond us. We're only seeing a small facet of it, of a much larger phenomenon that is beyond us. And then you have John Keel talking about ultra-terrestrials and how they're in some kind of spectrum, in this spectral universe that is beyond us and different to us, and they're entering and leaving, and we're only seeing some kind of one facet of them, perhaps, that's restricted from our viewpoint. Whereas McToney said, hold on a sec, why don't we make them... What if they're flesh and blood, nuts and bolts, and essentially no different to us in that respect, with robust nuts and bolts technologies that can appear to us as magical? If they have the capacity to cloak, to open and close wormholes to pass from one point to the next through sophisticated technologies, abilities to phase in and out of this reality in the sense of just shifting their atomic structure to pass through solid objects like walls, but nonetheless based on material, concrete science and technologies to achieve these magical kinds of things. I dug that. I really, that resonated with me, the idea of bringing it down to something earthly, tangible, that can be followed and hunted and chased, and build a profile of the beings, just as maybe, a detective would when they're seeking like serial criminal or something like that, and slowly build a picture through cases and cases of what the beings are like, their appearance and behavior and language and habitations and histories and reasons for being here, and each case serving to act as scaffolding for finding others that then serve to inform further and moving out and out with a more and more clear picture of what these beings are. If it turns out in the end that they are able to manipulate our reality so that they can be intangible and in a way sort of non-physical, nonetheless, I didn't want to start there. I thought if you start at the woo-woo, you'll never find them. And you can build to that perhaps, but you have to start with something tangible. So and writing my book as well, I left my own experiences to the end because I wanted it to be as objective as possible, which is difficult as an experiencer. I try my best, but what I did is I basically said, I already know these people and know a lot about them from them telling me where they're from, what they are. I am now going to look through the literature, ancient and modern, find them and show them to people, but do it in a way that other people can consider to be more rigorous or scientific, or and then hit people at the end of my book with the revelation that I've been interacting with them all my life. If I started off with that, I thought I would probably lose a lot of people that wouldn't ever bother considering the investigation because I've already made them think I'm a little bit, not quite right. But anyway.
No, I don't. I understand your reasons for doing so, but that wouldn't have affected me at all. One thing that really fascinated me about the book, and you talked about reasons for them being here, sort of their kind of origin story, which is kind of our origin story, is the time travel aspect. I found that, I'm fascinated with time travel anyway, but there's a lot of really intricate plot lines going on as far as who is doing what, why they're here, where they're from, and why are they interacting with us? One thing that you bring up is the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah. Well, this is where I also lose a lot of people that have been in ufology for the last couple of decades, because the name Dan Burish is a very dirty one when it comes to mainstream ufology. In fact, I think I say in my book, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say he's one of the least believed people in ufology, claiming to have, worked for the secret government or had experiences and things like that. Lots of people really don't like the guy and don't believe him. Having said that, I came to believe him through having interactions with beings that he describes in his what would you call it, like his cosmology or his ontology that he builds in his testimonies. Instead of focusing on, a paper trail of the man himself and whether or not he, you can find the paper trail of him attending the institutions he claimed to have been a student at, or the qualifications and degrees that he claims to have had and things like this. I believe Bob Lazar as well, and I know that disinformation and counterintelligence can really murky the waters when it comes to this kind of thing, of people who have genuinely been involved in secret projects. So with Dan Burish, instead of just focusing on that, because if you do that, the universities deny that he has his PhD, and he's meant to have been employed in places when he claims he wasn't there, and all this kind of stuff. But if you look at what he says about the nature of reality, what ETs are, where they're from, who they are, why they are here, what they look like, the way they behave, their histories, etc. I went for that, and his description of what he calls P52 Orions is spot on. Okay, so when I was having experiences over my life, when I was younger, the beings had said to me that they are the saucepan people, and I didn't really understand what that meant. As I got older, I came to understand that they were saying that they were Orion people. So in Australia, we call Orion the saucepan. and Orion's upside down to us, and it's a part of Orion anyway, sort of looks to us like a pot or a pan with a handle on it or whatever, and Orion's belt's there. But so the Sourceman people or the Orion people, and then I'd said to them at one stage, you are so much like us, I think you are another kind of sister race to us, maybe from our ancient past that left and came back or something like that. And they said, it is more complicated than that. And then it was later on again, they said to me, we are you, we are your future. Now, when I started looking into Charles Hall, even though Charles Hall doesn't talk about the tall whites being time travelers or originally from Earth or anything like that, he suspects they might be from Arcturus, but he had no reason for thinking that other than just a couple of little things that happened. If you're familiar with his books, at one stage when he went to look through his theodolite that he'd used to measure the movement of the balloons in the heavens, for wind direction and speed and everything, he noticed that after a tall white had been looking through it himself, it was now pointed at Arcturus system. And then there were a couple of other little indications. So he presumed that they were aliens, completely alien to Earth, using Earth as some stopover point, and that they maybe were from Arcturus, but he admitted that they were evasive in responding to that, if he ever asked. But otherwise they behave and look in exactly the same way as the individuals that I know, the same race. So Charles Hall wasn't sure of their origins, but Dan Burish said the tall, fair beings with huge blue eyes that have highly sophisticated and incredible speed to their emotional responses. This is what Charles Hall said. This is also what Dan Burish said. Different to the way people normally consider in UFO lore. You know, when people talk about greys and they don't have any emotions, and maybe they're interacting with us because they're interested in our highly, intricate emotional lives, and maybe they miss something of that they want. The tall whites think that we have a lack of emotional response, and actually seriously question and wonder whether we truly have the capacity to love and things like this, because their emotional responses are much more intense than ours and change much more rapidly as well. So Dan Burish and Charles Hall had both spoken about this independently to each other. But Dan Burish said, from Orion, the middle star of Orion's belt, Al-Nalam, originally from the Earth. So future humans, tall, fair future humans with huge blue eyes, from Al-Nalam, there are time travelers. This perfectly matches the description of the individuals that I've known all my life. So that was a real plus for Dan Burish, in my opinion. So I listened to him very carefully from then on. And I also did something which won't mean much to a lot of people because it's anecdotal or whatever, but I actually did something which I don't normally do. I asked the beings if Dan Burish is truthful. First I said, is he telling the truth? First I said, is he telling the truth? And they said yes. And then I said, how much of what he says is true? And they said, pretty much all of it. And that's what they said verbatim, pretty much all of it, in colloquial English like that. And I was like, okay. And since then, my research has shown evidence over and over again that these beings have a relationship with Orion's belt. People might not like to think of as Antonio Villas-Boas, the beings he interacted with as being tall whites because they're too small. They're fair beings with huge blue eyes, white fine hair that barked and growled and things like this. There's the star map, what are called hieroglyphs that Boas drew. Squiggles and swirls, but 3 of the dots in the design align with Orion's belt, the 3 stars of Orion's belt. And then there's other evidence as well through cases that points towards this. Now the doctrine of, sorry, it took a long time to get to the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox. Okay. So the DCTP, or doctrine of convergent timeline paradox, is something that Dan Burish said was a term that was used by MJ12 and at S4 and certain people in the know that was descriptive of the nature of our reality and how time travel works. And it's similar to, or the way Dan Burish describes it, and I think Michael Schratt has talked about this at one stage there in one of his presentations he did, that it's similar to in Back to the Future 2, when they've gone and accidentally made a separate timeline. And then now there's a separate timeline. They go into the past and make changes, and instead of it affecting your own timeline, it branches another one off. So it's basically nowadays with all of the obsession with the multiverse in fictional narratives like superhero movies and children's shows and things like that. You can't go to the cinema anymore without it being about the DCTP, about the doctrine of divergent timeline paradox, about the idea of the multiverse being this expanding, spreading thing. And if you try to travel back, all you'll do is just branch off another one, which defeats what they call the grandfather paradox. The idea that what if you go back in time and try to murder your own grandfather? Well, then you would have never been born to have done it in the first place, etc. And there's a paradox. But this solves that by saying, no, you will never affect the timeline you came from. You'll just make a new one. Now, so that's what it means. Now, exactly why it's called the divergent timeline paradox, I'm not quite sure why those particular words are being used, but that's apparently what it's called. Now, the beings themselves at one stage talked to me about this and showed me like visual images. Anyway, so their ways of communication can be, if they're using their what you call telepath tech, I call it, or Charles Hall called electronics in their helmets, can be visual images that can actually block out your own vision as well. So while it's happening, sometimes I can't see out of my eyes because the visual image is taken over, and there'll be forests or buildings or like a short history being shown, or sometimes it is linguistic, so that it hits like it's an utterance in English, say, but it occurs much faster in a shorter period of time than someone could actually express it in English saying it. So a whole sentence will feel like it's happened in a fraction of a second, but at the same time nonetheless be a sentence in English that almost feels like it's solid, like it's three-dimensional or something, like it feels tangible.
Interesting.
And if they're particularly close when they do it, it actually feels like a thump in the middle of my head. And sometimes my ears pop when it happens as well. So there's different ways, and then abstract ideas as well, like ideas, notions, and things like that, not relating to visual images or linguistics. But sorry, I'm starting to ramble now. What were we talking about there? Sorry.
I was just no. I was just asking you to start off by explaining the doctrine of convergent timeline paradox.
Yes. So they've shown me the way time travel works. Sorry, that's what I was getting around to. In the visual kind of way that. So the way Dan Burish described it is slightly different to the way they showed it to me, which is not that traveling back in time causes anything to branch off anything, but that all timelines have always existed and always will. That you're not really going back into your past and branching one off. You are selecting a compatible timeline that is, for all intents and purposes, identical to the one you came from, but at an earlier point in its history. So if you wanted to go back to 1981, you find a timeline that is representative of the universe exactly at the point it was in your 1981, but is like that in another universe right now. And you step across to that. Which, I mean, in the end, that's splitting hairs, I suppose. It amounts to the same kind of thing where it's sort of interdimensional rather than time travel, in a sense.
Yeah, it sounds more like timeline hopping than going back in the past or the future.
Yeah, for sure.
Interesting. So you never, if you're going back to the past, for instance, you never go back to your own timeline's past. You go to another one?
You go to another one, yeah. I don't think, well, I'm not 100% sure, of course, but I don't think you can.
Sure.
I don't think you can go into the past of your own timeline.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So what is time? You mentioned tons of timelines and P45 J-Rods, P52 J-Rods, P52 Orions, P24 future humans. I mean, and then there's also timeline 2 and T2. Maybe if there's some way that you can encapsulate those or explain those and how they interact with each other.
Yeah, so the history of like this whole sort of cosmology, I suppose you'd call it, that Dan Burish paints in his testimonies is that there would have been cataclysms at the beginning of the 21st century. And in an alternative timeline to ours, it did happen. That in the early 2000s, there was solar flares, there was disruption on the Earth, power grids were all knocked out. Solar flares also caused a pole shift. And the beings that are visiting us now that are, you could call future humans or timeline hoppers or whatever, or cryptoterrestrials, I would call them, because they've been here for so long again now, living with us. But they are from this alternative timeline that will now never eventuate. And it was sort of on a knife edge there at one stage as to whether we'd end up going down their timeline, that it would have eventuated to them or something else. Now, some of them, including the Orions, the ones I talk about, stopped that from happening. So now, so there's timeline 1 and timeline 2 that Dan Burish talks about there. The one that would not involve cataclysms and the one that would have involved cataclysms. Now, presumably there's an infinite amount of timelines, really, when it comes down to it. But this is sort of like a functional fiction, where you say you take two major ideas of timelines and kinds of timelines and how they will go, and then there's like an infinite amount of variations in timeline 2, in timeline 1, and it would become completely nonsensical if you just tried to shave it down too much, I suppose, because you'll end up hitting the infinite. But there's timelines with a timeline 2 flavor, maybe you could say, and there's timelines with a timeline 1 flavor. And we've ended up going down the one that means no cataclysms, that the future is ours to make, that's different to the one that the beings themselves came from. Now, the beings themselves, or at least the Orions, are desperate to heal their own genetic maladies. And coming back here in the first place was one of their main reasons. So a lot of genetic manipulation and engineering has fragmented and unraveled their own genomes, for want of a better way of describing it. Something that they have never been able to heal, and have come back to their own ancient past and a planet that they were from, or a version of it, with ancient humans, which are us, to go back to the source before everything started to go awry, and the problems that they now have started to happen. Lengthening their lifespans is a big part of it as well. They deliberately tried to lengthen their own lifespans, which worked. They can ideally live to 700 or 800 years old, but in actuality, it has caused lots of different problems to them. They have healing. They don't heal properly if they're damaged. They have huge amounts of allergies. They have susceptible to a lot of different diseases that we wouldn't get or have. And they re-inject our own DNA into their new generations as they come, but always careful and deselecting certain unfavorable attributes. They're also fairly proud people. They like their own appearance. They interact with us. They interbreed with us. But they also make sure that they don't necessarily look that much like us. They want to maintain their own physical appearance for the most part. Sometimes you hear descriptions of tall whites being more stocky and heavily muscled, perhaps as a result of interbreeding with us, or even of being of darker skin tones and things like that, perhaps as a result of interbreeding with us. But for the most part, they're interested in fixing their maladies, pathologies, neuropathies, and that's the main reason for them coming back here, and the other races as well. But with the taxonomies, there's four races of future human beings that have given rise to fairy myths and a whole slew of different, paranormal beings through mythologies and religion and law all through the past few millennia. But the P24s, so P and then a number means present plus that many years. So P24s, present plus 24,000 years. They were flying the Roswell craft. They have a white sort of greyish kind of skin, get up to about 5 foot tall. Still have whites to their eyes, have very large craniums, still have whites to their eyes. Their faces look like a child's face, or sort of like quite sort of cute looking, like a little face, but with big eyes, usually brown irises, but sometimes blue or green. Large hands with slight claws on them, skin with that looks sort of like the underbelly of a snake or lizard. Has a sort of like a shine to it. 3 big fingers and a thumb. The Steve Boucher beings, the drawings he does, in my opinion, Steve Boucher, the Canadian, his interactions with what are called P24s, like the Roswell beings. Then you have P45, so present plus 45,000 years. The same race, further on again, over 20,000 years, after they've left Earth. So at the stage of the P24s, they hadn't left Earth yet, but then they ended up heading to Zeta Reticuli, where they evolved further. They got darker grey skin, larger claws, more obvious scales. The whites of their eyes are selected out. They're completely black eyes, a smaller cranium. Smaller, they only get up to about 4 foot tall, not 5. Then 7,000 years beyond them again, P52 J-rods that have more of a brown look to their skin, started to develop kind of like ridges across the tops of their heads. So when you think of the Virginia incident beings, the small brown, oily skinned reptile monkey, 4 foot tall beings with claws, these are P52 J-rods. It's also the race that Dan Burish interacted with in the clean sphere at S4. Now that's one branch of humanity, and the P52 Orions, or the tall whites, are a separate group of humanity that left the Earth earlier. When the cataclysms happened, the story goes that the elites in the alternative timeline, the elites had prepared for it, had created subterranean ways of sitting it out for prolonged periods. Those people ended up evolving into those 3 races that I described then. Whereas the people that were left on the surface to fend for themselves, they evolved in a different way. They ended up regaining technologies after a few thousand years and leaving Earth for the moon, then Mars. Over thousands of years this was happening, and then ended up traveling to an Earth-like planet orbiting Al-Nalam, the middle star of Orion's belt. And so these different races have been coming back. But now the way all of that works, how they are here and able to interact with each other in what appears to be a common timeline to them. I don't know how that works with all of these timelines branching off, or however the DCTP work. But the 2 of them are contemporaneous to each other. P52 J-rods, so little brownies, maybe you'll call them. And P52 Orions, or tall whites, they are from the same distance ahead of us in time, in the alternative timeline. They rediscovered each other, so they had forgotten that either existed, and then and then refound one another, compared notes, and said, "Hey, we both have all of these maladies and problems with our genetics," and they tried to assist each other. See whether each one had the rest of the deck that the other didn't have, to repair their genomic structures. And then they decided, no, this is not going to work. Homo sapiens at an early stage in their existence on Earth are more than the sum of their parts. We must go back. We can't recreate ourselves without tapping into the original genomic structure of naturally evolved humans from ancient times, from our old planet that we both have in common, So they came back together. So those 2 races are closely allied. And as far as I'm aware, they're the only 2 left. but the other two aren't here anymore. Now, you know, when you hear paranormal stories about something like a Grim Reaper, they often wear floor-length hooded cloaks, especially their priests. Something like a Grim Reaper with a skeletal face and a hood and a cloak, being accompanied by wrinkly-faced, black-eyed demonic creatures that might be in hoods and cloaks as well. You've got these tall beings and short beings. These are these allied races. The P-52J rods, or Sabethina, they call themselves. Well, sorry, the Orions call them, I don't know what they call themselves. The Orions call the little brown ones Sabethina, and the Orions call themselves Madhyana. And I'm not sure what those words mean, but they're from their own language.
I wonder if the lengthening of their breeding time has something to do with the jumping of timelines.
I'm not sure. What's going on with that? Not sure.
It seems like the aging process is different for them, and I just wonder if that has something to do with them being able to jump these timelines. It just seems like that somehow those two things are related.
They may be. I think they've messed with their own DNA to ensure that they are longer lived beings, like we are trying to do now. You know, right. The idea of us, we're sort of on the precipice of doing these kinds of things ourselves, and perhaps falling for the same, problems that they ended up developing. But, you know, lengthening our lifespans, trying to do away with disease and all this kind of stuff. But as for them having really long lifespans, if everything goes well for them, if they end up being healthy and avoiding disease, I mean, it must be very handy in general for also, you know, planning the future, interacting with, you know, like piloting reality. I think I mentioned this in the book as well. The idea that they can future view, but view potentials. Dan Burrish talked about the Orion cube that was a gift to our world leaders at one stage that was taken back, I think, because it was misused. Now, they can, just as you pilot a research project by testing it before implementing it and making changes, or piloting a TV series by creating some kind of movie length episode and sending it out there and seeing how people react. The Orions or Madhyana can pilot a reality by looking into potential futures and deciding if they behave and do certain things now in different ways, how is that going to impact upon the world as this sort of holistic, systemic soup of reality out there into our future. If they do this now, it'll cause this, which might branch out and do this, that, and the other. And they're not, they're not at the whim of, what would you say, like, at the chaos of like random events and things like that, like we are. They have the capacity through technologies to really pinpoint how they want the future to go and be planning ahead, acting now and doing things that might not make sense now if you have a limited perspective and don't have the full view that they have. But then it'll mean 10 years, 20, 50 years, 100 years, maybe even 1,000 years in the future. It's going to have some desired result that ensures the survival of their species or the survival of the Earth. The survival of the Earth, which is very important to them, and maintaining a healthy biosphere. And we're important to them as well, of course, not just in a sort of brotherly, sisterly kind of way of us being very closely related, but also in a more selfish kind of way. They require us also to keep their own genetic health because they need, fairly regular hits, maybe you could say, from our genomic structure. But having really long lifespans would help with all that kind of stuff. If you're projecting yourself out, especially if you have an investment, a vested interest in making desired results happen in the distant future, because you're still going to be alive then as well. It's firsthand. It's not an abstract idea. I'm doing this for my descendants.
So they can do that without affecting the future. they can observe the future. It's not like creating another timeline by observing the future.
Well, I'm not sure whether just by viewing it, they're altering things as well. You'd imagine that's a good possibility, with the implications of, the new physics and people talking about, the observer being a very important element of a system, or Schrodinger's cat and all that kind of stuff. You'd imagine even them looking is going to be messing with things, I suppose, potential worlds and things like that. I suppose they take that kind of stuff into account. They must do. Otherwise, it wouldn't be working for them, and they wouldn't be utilizing it, taking advantage of it as much as they do. And this is also sacred to them. So they don't have, they're highly spiritual beings in a way. They run the whole gamut of different personality types, and some of them are very cruel, particularly people in their military. They have a sophisticated military system, like a highly stratified, highly regimented, and certain individuals that gravitate towards that also can be sort of questionable morally or ethically. Then you also have priesthoods that, filled with people that are more compassionate, as you'd imagine, and but when it comes down to it, the worldview of their race is one of recognizing a kind of sacred element to future looking. So it's it's like scrying, I suppose you'd say. They scry, SCRY. They're using crystal balls. It's the technology. It's like it's prophetic technologies, and to them, even though it's technological based, it's sacred. And they, and lots of elements of their society sort of have this sacred element that maybe we would not, or in the West anyway, maybe we wouldn't necessarily consider all the elements of our reality to be as sacred as they do. So and they have this, their own sort of religious system is sort of similar to some kinds of Eastern mysticism, although, so in Western tradition, people have had these kinds of ideas for a long time as well. I think like in Gnostic Christianity, some of these ideas, and also some Islamic and Judaic sects have had these kinds of ideas of a mystical reality of unifying with the one, of consciousness being at the seat of all, all of us being essentially one being in one place at one time, experiencing the world in a retracted kind of way. Each of us believes that we're separate from other people, separate to other times, and separate from other places, but everything is in one. These kinds of sentiments are especially popular these days, I suppose, in New Age belief system, things like that, but they're also, built into lots of Eastern, like Kashmir Shaivism, a kind of Hinduism, and also, Yogacara Buddhism, and I think there's a couple of other different Buddhist sects that really get into that kind of element, and some kinds of Christianity again, and that permeates their world, really.
Maybe you could tell the listeners where they could find your book online and where they can find you and your work.
The book's on Amazon, so as paperback, hardcover, or ebook. Not available as audio, unfortunately. It was going to be, but there was a bit of a hiccup, so that's been put aside for now. But and I have a YouTube channel, which is just my name, Ryan Musgrave-Evans. And if you want to have a yarn with me, if you have information you think I might be interested in, or any questions or anything like that, my email address is in the About section of my YouTube channel under business inquiries. Just prove you're not a robot. Okay. And anyone who wants to say g'day, be very welcome. And thanks, guys.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you. And we will keep in touch, and I'll let you know when this goes live, and you can share it willy-nilly.
Great. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you so much, Ryan.
Bye-bye.
Yes, it's been a blast.
All right.
Farewell.
Care.
See you later.
Well, that ends the free 1-hour version of the interview. To join us for the second part of the interview, visit patreon.com/themeltpodcast and sign up for a monthly subscription for as little as $3. In the second half, we discuss more about Orion's Cube, Ryan's recent CT experiences, which sometimes involve confusing telepathic communication, traveling with CTs in their crafts, and underground excursions with the CTs. Until next time, Take care. If you've liked what you've heard and would like to contribute to the melt, there are a few ways that you can do that. The most tangible would be financially. Just click the Patreon link in the episode notes, and there you will find ways that you can contribute for as little as $3 a month. This will give you access to bonus episodes, early access to regular episodes, and you can also participate in monthly Zoom meetups. Contributing financially will also help make the melt better, pay the bills, and help to make this podcast a full-time endeavor that I can fully devote my time to and provide you with more content. Another way of contributing would be to go to wherever it is that you subscribe to The Melt and give it a favorable review or rating, and this will help it to reach more people. You can also spread the word to friends and family via social media, email, or word of mouth. And lastly, if none of those options are readily available or appealing to you, simply send your positive thoughts and intentions. In an interconnected and quantumly entangled multiverse, these also go a long way. Thank you.